When we think of the Middle Ages, images of knights, castles, and royal feasts come to mind. But behind all this romance lay a harsh reality. Winter in England was not just cold, it was deadly. Rivers froze over, roads were covered in snow, and temperatures in homes, even the wealthiest ones, dropped to zero. Surviving in such conditions was a real art, where every element of architecture mattered. These were not modern houses with central heating and warm floors. They were stone fortresses that had to be tamed. Today, we will talk about how medieval architects solved this complex problem. What methods did they use? And why didn't even the strongest walls always protect against the cold? Watch the video to the end to find out how one small architectural detail could mean the difference between suffocating from smoke or freezing to death. In medieval houses, especially in cities, multi-story buildings were common. This was done not only to save space, but also to conserve heat. The coldest rooms, storerooms and workshops, were located on the first floor. The living rooms, where people spent most of their time, were located on the second and third floors. Heat from the fireplace rose upward, and the upper floors were much warmer than the first floor. In addition, the floors of the upper floors were wooden, which in itself was better insulation than stone floors. In some houses, double floors with an air gap were even made, which helped to retain heat even more. The multi-story design of medieval houses was not just an architectural whim, but a well-thought-out strategy. The first floor, which was always the coldest and darkest, was used for storing food, tools, and workshops. It housed pantries, storerooms, and sometimes stables. The cold from the ground and the lack of windows made it unsuitable for living, but ideal for storing perishable food. The second floor was usually the main living space. It housed the main rooms, such as the living room or reception hall. It also had a fireplace, which was the center of home life. The heat from the fireplace rose upward, making the second floor much warmer than the first. The third and fourth floors, if there were any, were used as bedrooms. The heat rising from the lower floors made them the warmest. In addition, the bedrooms were further away from street noise and smells, making them more comfortable for sleeping. If you lived in such a house, which floor would you prefer to live on, and why? Tell us in the comments. The problem of water supply in multi-story houses was solved with wells, which were often located in the courtyard or next to the house. Water had to be carried to the upper floors by hand, which was very laborious. Wooden basins and buckets were used for washing and other household needs. Some wealthy homes even had special rooms for bathing, but they were not used as often as we might think, due to the high cost of fuel for heating water. The sewage system in medieval cities was primitive. Most houses did not have toilets in the modern sense. In castles and wealthy homes, there were special ledges in the walls called wardrobes that served as toilets. Waste fell straight down into a ditch or onto the street. In cities, waste was simply thrown out onto the streets, leading to unsanitary conditions and unpleasant odors. Multi-story houses reflected the hierarchy of society. The top floor, which was the warmest and brightest, was often occupied by the owners of the house. The lower floors, which were colder and darker, were intended for servants, as well as workshops and storage rooms. This division was not only functional, but also social. It reflected the status and privileges that each member of the family enjoyed. In cities where houses were built close together, multi-story buildings also helped to combat fires. The lower floors, made of stone, did not burn, and the upper floors, made of wood, could be quickly rebuilt. This was very important at a time when fires were a frequent occurrence. Thus, multi-story construction was not only a survival strategy, but also a reflection of the social structure and economic realities of medieval society. We are used to thinking that thick stone walls are a reliable protection against everything. In fact, this is not entirely true. Stone is a poor heat insulator. It cools quickly and heats slowly. Therefore, although thick walls protected against wind and precipitation, they did not save from the cold. To solve this problem, builders used several tricks. For example, they made walls with internal air gaps. This was a kind of precursor to modern insulation materials. Another important element was plaster. It was applied to the walls from the inside, which helped reduce heat loss and make the walls smoother. Rich people could afford to cover the walls with fabric or wood, which also helped to retain heat. In some houses, the interior partitions were made of wood, and the space between them was filled with adobe, a mixture of clay, straw, and manure. This coat insulated the room perfectly, preventing heat from escaping. The choice of building materials was one of the most important issues in the Middle Ages. On the one hand, wood, as you might expect, was the best insulator. It was more affordable, easier to work with, and houses made of wood could be built more quickly. However, wood had one significant drawback: it burned easily. In an era when heating was provided by open fires in fireplaces, fires were very common. A single ember flying out of a fireplace could destroy an entire house in a matter of minutes. In large cities where houses were built close together, a fire could destroy an entire neighborhood. Stone, although cold, was a non-combustible material. Castles and wealthy houses built of stone were safer. They could withstand fire and were more difficult to capture in the event of a siege. Therefore, when it came to durability and safety, stone was always preferred. To make stone walls warmer, medieval architects used several techniques. One of them was the use of wooden paneling. The interior walls of rooms were covered with wooden panels, which created an air gap between the stone and the wood. This gap was an excellent insulator and prevented cold air from entering the room. In poor houses where there was no money for wood, the walls were coated with clay plaster mixed with straw. This mixture, called adobe, was cheap and effective. It created an additional layer that helped to retain heat. Another important element was tapestries and curtains. They were hung on the walls to reduce heat loss and protect against drafts. Tapestries were not only decorative, but also part of the insulation system. The most vulnerable places in the house were the windows and doors. Cold air penetrated through the cracks, creating drafts. To solve this problem, doors were made very thick and covered with felt or leather. Window openings were made small and closed with shutters at night. Wealthy people could afford curtains made of thick woolen fabric, which were hung on the windows. This was not only beautiful, but also practical. Curtains helped to retain heat and protect against drafts. The use of adobe as insulation was particularly common in rural areas. Clay, straw, and manure were readily available and could be used to create very dense and warm walls. This technology was so effective that it is still used today. Another interesting technique was the use of double floors with an air gap filled with straw or earth. This created an additional layer of insulation and prevented cold from penetrating from the lower floors. Thus, medieval builders understood that even the thickest stone wall would not protect against the cold. They used various tricks and techniques to make their homes warmer and more comfortable. It was a kind of art where every element mattered. If thick walls were so ineffective against the cold, and wooden houses, which retained heat better, could be destroyed by a single spark, how could heat be retained in a medieval house? To find out how people solved this problem, read on. The floors in medieval houses were cold and dirty. Made of stone or earth, they did not provide any heat. To solve this problem, people laid straw, reeds, or grass on the floor. This was a kind of carpet that provided at least some insulation. Straw was not the best solution, of course, as it could attract vermin and had to be changed frequently, but it was better than walking on cold stone. However, there was also a more complex system, the hypocaust, a floor heating system that originated in Roman times. Yes, it was complicated and very expensive, but in some monasteries and wealthy castles, it was used to heat individual rooms. A hypocaust is a system of floor and wall heating that was widespread in the Roman Empire, especially in baths and villas. After the fall of Rome, this technology was almost forgotten, but in the Middle Ages it was revived in some monasteries and castles. The principle of the hypocaust was simple. A space was created under the floor of the room, supported by brick or stone columns. A furnace was built into one of the walls where wood was burned. Hot air from the furnace passed through channels under the floor and in the walls, heating them. Smoke and combustion products escaped through special openings in the roof. In this way, the room was heated evenly, without smoke or soot. Of course, hypocausts were very expensive to build and operate. They required a lot of firewood, and their construction was complex and labor-intensive. Therefore, only the wealthiest could afford such a system. For those who could not afford a hypocaust, there were simpler solutions. One of them was a brazier, a metal container in which hot coals were placed. The brazier could be moved from room to room and provided heat. It was often placed under a table to warm the feet or next to the bed. However, braziers had one significant drawback. They emitted carbon monoxide, which was very dangerous. Therefore, they could only be used in well-ventilated rooms, which made them less effective. In addition to fireplaces and braziers, there were also stoves in the Middle Ages. They were more efficient because the heat was retained inside and the smoke escaped through a chimney. Stoves were similar to modern ones but were made of stone or brick. They were very expensive and only the wealthy could afford them. Stoves were very practical. They could be used not only for heating but also for cooking. You could bake bread, cook soup, or roast meat in them. This was very convenient because you didn't have to light a separate fire for each activity. The way houses were heated in the Middle Ages was a direct reflection of social status. Peasants and ordinary townspeople were content with an open hearth in the center of the room, which was cheap but dangerous and smoky. They often huddled around a single source of heat, sharing it with the whole family. Their lives were directly linked to the seasonal cycles. In winter, they suffered from the cold, and in summer, they enjoyed the warmth. Rich people, on the other hand, could afford fireplaces, stoves, and even hypocausts. These technologies not only kept them warm, but also symbolized their power and wealth. A fireplace in the reception hall was not just a source of heat, but the center of social life. It was a place where guests gathered, feasts were held, and important decisions were made. It was a time when every detail mattered, and even the way a person kept warm spoke of their social status. Medieval people used various heating systems, from the simplest to the most complex. It was a time when every detail mattered, and even the way a person kept warm spoke of their social status. Furniture in medieval homes was not just for sitting, it also helped to keep the heat in. Beds, for example, were not just a place to sleep, but real fortresses. They had high wooden backs and canopies that helped to keep the heat in. Beds were often placed next to the fireplace to keep the sleeping area warmer. Another element was chests, which were used not only for storage but also as seats. Clothes or blankets could be stored inside the chests, which helped keep the house tidy. To avoid drafts, wealthy people hung tapestries and thick curtains on the walls. These were not only decorative, but also provided additional insulation, preventing cold air from entering the room. In medieval houses, where it was very cold, the bed was not just a piece of furniture, but a real refuge. Rich people slept on beds with canopies, which served as a kind of tent. Curtains covering the bed on all sides helped to retain the heat emitted by the body. This was very important, as it was almost impossible to sleep in cold rooms without such protection. People slept on straw or wool mattresses and covered themselves with thick wool blankets. Some homes even used fur blankets, which were very expensive and indicated the high status of the owner. Chests were one of the most common pieces of furniture in the Middle Ages. They were used not only for storing clothes, linen, and other valuables, but also as seats, tables, or even beds. Chests were very practical because they could be easily moved from room to room. Clothes could be stored inside chests, which helped keep the house tidy. Moreover, chests were part of the insulation system. They were placed against walls to close gaps and prevent cold air from entering. We are used to thinking of tapestries and curtains as works of art, but in the Middle Ages they served a very important function. Tapestries hung on the walls were not only decorative, but also provided an extra layer of insulation. They helped to keep the heat in and protected against drafts coming through cracks in the walls. Curtains hung on windows and doors also helped to keep the heat in. They were made of thick woolen fabric and prevented cold air from entering the room. In addition to beds and chests, medieval houses had other furniture. Benches were the main place to sit. They were long and made of wood, which helped to retain heat. They were often placed next to the fireplace to keep warm. Tables were large and massive. They were used not only for eating, but also for working. Tables were a very important element, as candles and lamps could be placed on them to light the room. Furniture in medieval homes was not just interior decoration, but part of a complex system that helped people survive the harsh winters. Every element, from the four-poster bed to the tapestry on the wall, had its own meaning and helped keep the house warm and comfortable. Furniture in the home is important and necessary, but what if at some point the food ran out? Would these people have been able to survive if they hadn't learned how to store their supplies cleverly? Read on to find out how medieval people solved this problem. Even in the warmest house, it is impossible to survive without food. In winter, food was scarce. People ate salted, smoked, or dried foods that they had prepared in the summer. Fresh fruits and vegetables were very rare, and only the wealthiest could afford them. The staple diet consisted of bread, cheese, salted meat, and dried fish. Alcoholic beverages, such as ale and cider, were popular, as water was often unclean. Alcohol not only kept people warm, but also helped prevent diseases associated with drinking poor-quality water. In the Middle Ages, there were no refrigerators, so people used various methods to preserve food for the winter. The most common method was salting. Meat and fish were salted in barrels, which allowed them to be stored for several months. Smoking was also popular. Meat and fish were smoked over a fire, which not only gave them flavor, but also increased their shelf life. Another method was drying. Fruit, berries, and mushrooms were dried in the sun or in ovens. This allowed them to be preserved for a long time and used as food additives. The diet of people in the Middle Ages depended heavily on social status. Rich people could afford to eat meat and fish, as well as exotic spices. They could buy products that did not grow in England, such as wine, sugar, and spices. Ordinary people ate what they could grow or hunt. Their diet consisted mainly of bread made from rye or barley flour, cheese, vegetables that could be stored, and fish. Meat was a luxury and was only eaten on holidays. Water in the Middle Ages was not very clean and dangerous to drink. Therefore, people drank ale and cider. Ale was a weak beer brewed from barley. It was drunk by everyone, from peasants to kings. Cider was made from apples and drunk in regions where apple trees grew. Alcoholic beverages were not just for quenching thirst. They were a source of calories and also helped prevent diseases associated with drinking poor-quality water. Food in the Middle Ages had not only a functional, but also a symbolic meaning. In wealthy homes, feasts were a sign of status and power. Lots of meat, game, sweets, and wine were served. It was a kind of competition to see who could feed their guests the most exquisite dishes. Ordinary people ate very modestly, and their food was simple and unpretentious. But even their diet had room for symbolism. For example, bread was a symbol of life and prosperity, and cheese was a symbol of hard work. In conclusion, food and drink in the Middle Ages were not only fuel for the body, but also a reflection of social status and a vital element for survival. Winter was a time of scarcity, and to survive it, people used all their knowledge and skills. Medieval builders did not have modern instruments, but they had a deep knowledge of nature and its laws. The first and most important principle they used in construction was the correct orientation of the building. Windows and main entrances were always placed on the south side. This was done not for beauty, but for warmth. Sunlight entering the house heated the massive stone walls, which then gave off heat back into the room. This was passive solar heating. The north side of the building, on the other hand, had fewer windows and was more protected. Its walls were made thicker so that they would retain heat better and keep out the cold. Even in the largest castles, where there were dozens of windows, their location was carefully thought out to maximize the amount of light and heat. Medieval builders in England knew very well that every available resource had to be used to survive the harsh winters. The sun was one of them. They understood that the south side of the house received the most sunlight and heat during the day. Therefore, they did not simply place windows on the south side, but made them larger and, where possible, located them in the rooms where people spent the most time, the living room or bedroom. The north side of the house, on the other hand, was always the coldest. There is almost no sun here, and cold winds blow from this side. Therefore, on the north side of the house, they made a minimum number of windows or did not make them at all. Here they located storerooms, kitchens, or other uninhabited rooms that did not require constant heating. In castles, this principle was even more important. The donjon, or main tower, was often oriented according to the cardinal points so that its living quarters received maximum light and heat. The thickest and most impregnable walls usually faced north to protect the castle from enemies and the cold. When choosing a location for a house or castle, medieval builders also took the landscape into account. They tried to build houses in low-lying areas or in places protected from the wind by hills or forests. This helped to reduce heat loss and protect the house from drafts. In cities where the landscape was less varied, houses were built close together. This was done not only to save space, but also to protect the houses from the cold. The walls of houses adjacent to each other created a kind of thermal insulation that helped to retain heat. The interior layout of the house was also important. The largest and most formal rooms, such as reception rooms, were located on the ground floor and were only used during the warmer months. During the colder months, people moved to smaller, cozier rooms that were easier to heat. In addition, wealthy homes had special rooms designed for heating. For example, solariums were rooms with large windows on the south side that were used to warm up in the sun. These were a kind of precursor to modern solariums. Thus, the orientation of a house to the cardinal points was not just an architectural whim, but a necessity of life. It was one of the most important principles that helped people survive the harsh medieval winters. But what if the sun didn't come out? All you could do was hope for a fire. But how could you keep your house from turning into a giant torch? Keep reading to find out how they solved this problem. Medieval builders in England knew very well that every available resource had to be used to survive the harsh winters. The sun was one of them. They understood that the south side of the house received the most sunlight and heat during the day. Therefore, they didn't just place windows on the south side, but made them larger and, where possible, located them in the rooms where people spent the most time, the living room or bedroom. The north side of the house, on the other hand, was always the coldest. There is almost no sun here, and cold winds blow from this side. Therefore, on the north side of the house, they made a minimum number of windows or did not make them at all. Here they located storerooms, kitchens, or other uninhabited rooms that did not require constant heating. In castles, this principle was even more important. The donjon, or main tower, was often oriented according to the cardinal points so that its living quarters received maximum light and heat. The thickest and most impregnable walls usually faced north to protect the castle from enemies in the cold. When choosing a location for a house or castle, medieval builders also took the landscape into account. They tried to build houses in low-lying areas or in places protected from the wind by hills or forests. This helped to reduce heat loss and protect the house from drafts. In cities where the landscape was less varied, houses were built close together. This was done not only to save space, but also to protect the houses from the cold. The walls of houses adjacent to each other created a kind of thermal insulation that helped to retain heat. The interior layout of the house was also important. The largest and most formal rooms, such as reception rooms, were located on the ground floor and were only used during the warmer months. During the colder months, people moved to smaller, cozier rooms that were easier to heat. In addition, wealthy homes had special rooms designed for heating. For example, solariums were rooms with large windows on the south side that were used to warm up in the sun. These were a kind of precursor to modern solariums. The orientation of a house relative to the cardinal points was not just an architectural whim, but a necessity for survival. It was one of the most important principles that helped people survive the harsh medieval winters. But what if the sun didn't come out at some point? All you could do was hope for a fire. But how could you keep your house from turning into a giant torch? Keep reading to find out how this problem was solved. The fireplace was the heart of a medieval home. It was not just a source of heat, but also a place for cooking, lighting, and socializing. However, it came with many problems. A wood-burning fireplace consumed a huge amount of fuel and produced a lot of smoke. To solve this problem, architects invented chimneys, special channels that remove smoke from the room. Chimneys first appeared in the 12th century and were a real revolution. They allowed people to heat their homes without suffocating from smoke. But there were some nuances. The chimney had to be tall enough to provide good draft and wide enough to be cleaned. Moreover, fireplaces were often located in the center of the room so that the heat would spread throughout the entire space. But even then, the heat quickly escaped through the windows and doors. In the early Middle Ages, the hearth was simply a pit in the center of the room. The smoke from it escaped through an opening in the roof, which created problems with smoke. With the advent of chimneys, people's lives changed. The chimney removed smoke from the room, making it cleaner and safer. It was a real technological breakthrough that significantly improved living conditions and made medieval homes more comfortable and safer. The first chimneys were simple. They were just a channel in the wall that led to the roof. Over time, they became more complex. Architects began to make chimneys with elbows and turns to improve draft and prevent rain from getting inside. Fireplaces also became more complex. They were built with large fireboxes where large logs could be placed. Mantelpieces were built above the fireplace, where clothes could be dried or dishes stored. The main fuel for fireplaces was wood. There were many forests in England, but wood was expensive. It had to be chopped, dried, and delivered to the house, which was very labor-intensive. Therefore, ordinary people could not afford to heat their fireplaces constantly. They only lit them on the coldest days. Rich people, on the other hand, could afford to keep their fireplaces lit all the time. Castles had many fireplaces, and they were lit around the clock. This created problems with wood supplies, and large castles had special people who were responsible for delivering and storing fuel. Fireplaces were inefficient because most of the heat escaped through the chimney. In addition, they produced a lot of soot and smoke and had to be cleaned frequently, which was an additional labor-intensive task. Fireplaces, despite their importance, had many problems. They were inefficient as most of the heat escaped through the chimney. They produced a lot of soot and smoke and had to be cleaned frequently. Another problem was the risk of fire. A single ember flying out of the fireplace could start a fire. Therefore, buckets of water were always kept in the house. The fireplace was not only a source of heat, it was used for cooking. Pots were hung over the fire to cook soups and porridge. Meat was roasted on the fire. Smoke houses were hung over the fire to smoke fish and meat. The fireplace was also a source of light. Candles were placed in it, and the fire lit up the room. Therefore, the fireplace was the center of life in the house. It was a place where everyone gathered to warm up, eat, and socialize. Thus, the fireplace was not just an architectural element. It was a symbol of life, warmth, and security. It was a world where the fireplace was the heart of the home, and without it, it would have been impossible to survive the harsh winters. Windows were the weakest point in a medieval house. Until the 14th century, most houses did not have glass. Window openings were covered with shutters, parchment, animal skins, or simply thick fabric. This was ineffective, as it did not let in light or protect from the cold. Glass was very expensive, and only the richest could afford it. But even glass windows were not ideal. They consisted of small pieces of glass joined together with lead partitions. This was not airtight, and cold air penetrated through the gaps. Therefore, windows were always small. The smaller the window, the less heat was lost. To avoid drafts but still have some source of light, mica or grease film was sometimes used in the windows of wealthy homes. These were thin, almost transparent sheets that let light through but kept the cold out. Of course, this was not an ideal solution, but it allowed the room to be lit without opening the shutters. In the homes of ordinary people, where there was no glass, window openings were a real headache. During the day, they were opened to let in light, and at night they were closed with shutters. In the cold season, when it was very cold outside, the windows were covered with thick cloth or animal skins to keep out the cold. But this deprived people of light. To solve this problem, people used various materials that let light through but kept the cold out. One such material was parchment. It was made from dried animal skin. Parchment was semi-transparent and let light through, but it was very expensive. Another material was mica. It was more affordable than glass and was used in some houses. Mica was thin and translucent, and it let light through, but it was very fragile. The appearance of glass in windows was a real revolution. The first panes of glass were small and made by hand. They were very expensive, and only the richest people could afford them. The glass was inserted into lead partitions that formed a pattern. This was not airtight, and cold air penetrated through the gaps. To solve this problem, windows were made small. The smaller the window, the less heat was lost. In addition, windows were often placed high above the floor to prevent heat loss. With the advent of glass in windows, houses became brighter and warmer. But even with them, people continued to use curtains and shutters to protect themselves from the cold. Curtains in medieval houses were not only a decorative element, but also part of the insulation system. They were made of thick woolen fabric and hung on windows. Curtains helped to retain heat and protect against drafts. In wealthy homes, curtains were very expensive and often decorated with embroidery. They were a symbol of wealth and status. Interior shutters were also very common. They were made of wood and closed at night to keep out the cold. Shutters were very effective as they provided an extra layer of protection from the cold. Thus, windows in medieval houses were a real problem that people tried to solve in various ways. It was a world where light and heat were luxuries, and people used every opportunity to obtain them. In the dungeons and cellars that were part of every castle, a life hidden from prying eyes was in full swing. In addition to being the perfect place to store supplies, dungeons served many other equally important functions, without which survival in the castle would have been impossible. In most castles and fortresses, wells were located in the dungeons. This was done for a reason. First, it was strategically important. In the event of a siege, when access to external water sources was cut off, the well in the dungeon provided the inhabitants with drinking water, which allowed them to hold out longer. Second, deep underground, water did not freeze even in the harshest winters, which was vital. Some castles, especially those built on hills, had complex systems for collecting rainwater. Water from the roof flowed through special gutters and pipes into cisterns located in the basement. This water was used for domestic purposes, washing dishes, laundry, etc. Dungeons often served as secret passages and hideouts. In the event of an attack or fire, they could be used to leave the castle unnoticed. These passages were also used to secretly deliver food and weapons during long sieges, giving the castle's defenders an advantage. The dungeons often housed workshops where blacksmiths, carpenters, and other craftsmen worked. This was done not only to hide noise and smells, but also to protect valuable tools and materials from fire. Weapons, armor, and other valuables were also stored here. The dungeons had their own ventilation system, which ensured a supply of fresh air. This was very important, as in an enclosed space without ventilation, the air could become heavy and stale. Thus, the dungeons were not just dark and damp rooms. They were a multifunctional complex that was vital for survival in the castle and provided its inhabitants with safety, water, and other necessary resources. Even the most ingenious architecture could not completely protect against the cold. Therefore, clothing was the last and most important line of defense. People wore many layers of clothing to help keep warm. Rich people wore clothes made of wool, fur, and velvet. They also used gloves, hats, and scarves to protect themselves from the cold. At a time when central heating was just a fantasy, clothing was not just a fashion statement, but a necessity. A person who could not afford warm clothes was doomed to suffer from the cold. In poorly heated homes, people relied on their clothes. The key principle was layering. First, they wore a thin linen or cotton shirt, which absorbed moisture and allowed the skin to breathe. On top of this, they wore woolen shirts or tunics, which served as the main layer of insulation. Wool was excellent at retaining heat, even when wet, which was very important. Wealthy people added another layer, a doublet or pourpoint, which was made of thick fabric and often had a lining. This layer not only kept them warm, but also created a fashionable silhouette. The material from which clothing was made directly indicated a person's status. Ordinary people wore clothes made of coarse, unprocessed wool, which was very warm but prickly. The wealthy could afford fine, soft wool, as well as silk and velvet. Fur was the most expensive material. Ordinary people could wear rabbit or squirrel fur, but the rich wore ermine, sable, or mink. Fur was used to line clothes and trim collars and cuffs, which not only kept you warm, but also emphasized high status. In the Middle Ages, people used many accessories to protect themselves from the cold. Gloves were a very important part of clothing. They were made of leather, and rich people wore gloves made of silk or velvet. Hats and hoods were an integral part of winter clothing. They protected the head and ears from the cold and wind. Rich people wore hats made of fur and velvet, decorated with feathers and precious stones. Scarves and muffs were also popular. Muffs were a kind of pouch into which you could put your hands to keep them warm. Footwear was just as important as clothing. Common people wore rough leather boots that kept their feet from freezing. Rich people wore more elegant shoes, but even these were made of thick leather and lined with fur. In the end, clothes in the Middle Ages weren't just a fashion thing. They were a complex and multi-layered tool for survival. Every piece, from a thin linen shirt to a fur hat, had a purpose and helped people get through the harsh winters. It was a world where clothes were the last line of defense against the cold. We have immersed ourselves in a world where surviving the winter was a real art. Architecture, which today seems simple and inconvenient to us, was in fact a carefully thought-out system designed to combat the cold. It was a world where every element, from the location of windows to the thickness of walls, had its own meaning. What surprised you the most about what you saw today? Which architectural technique did you find the most ingenious or, conversely, the most absurd? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos about the secrets of history.